The cold wind howled through the nearly empty parking lot as Sarah Walker pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders. It had been a long shift at the diner, and all she wanted was to pick up her son, drive home, and collapse into bed. The quiet town she had moved to was supposed to be safe, a place where she and her son, Liam, could start over. But some things never changed, some people never changed. As she walked toward her car, parked beneath the flickering glow of a street lamp, she noticed them. A group of men, lingering near the far side of the lot. Their voices were low, their laughter sharp, cutting through the night air like a warning. Sarah had spent enough time in dangerous situations to know when something wasn't right. Her heart rate didn't spike, though. Instead, a deep, familiar calm settled over her. She wasn't afraid. One of the men stepped forward, his boots scraping against the asphalt. "Hey, sweetheart," he called out, his tone dripping with mockery. "You lost." Sarah didn't stop walking. She didn't flinch. She kept her movements casual, measured, but her mind was already assessing the situation. 5 of them, late 20s, early 30s. Muscular, but untrained in how they held themselves. She had dealt with worse, much worse. "You hear me?" the man continued, stepping closer. "Or are you too good to talk to us?" Sarah finally stopped, tilting her head slightly. She didn't respond right away, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make them uncomfortable. It worked. Another man chuckled. "Look at her. Thinks she's too tough." Tough didn't even begin to describe her. "Maybe she needs a lesson in manners," a third voice said. Sarah exhaled slowly. She could still smell the coffee and grease from the diner on her clothes, but underneath that was the familiar scent of trouble, a scent she had lived with for most of her life. One of the men, a tall one with a jagged scar along his jaw, stepped forward, blocking her path. He smiled, but there was nothing friendly about it. "You don't belong here," he said, his voice lower now, more serious. "People like you never do." Ah, there it was. The reason behind their hostility. Sarah had had it before, seen it in the eyes of men who thought the world belonged only to them. She wasn't interested in a fight, but if they pushed, she would end it before they even knew what happened. She took a step forward, just enough to invade his space. He expected her to back down. Instead, she held his gaze, her expression unreadable. "Moved," he said, her voice quiet but firm. Scarjaw hesitated. It was only for a second, but Sarah caught it. He wasn't used to being challenged. Not like this. Not by someone who wasn't supposed to be a threat. The others shifted behind him, waiting for his reaction. He had a choice: let her go or prove something to his friends. And Sarah already knew what choice he was going to make. "You got a mouth on you, don't you?" he sneered, stepping even closer. "Maybe we should teach you how to." He never got to finish that sentence. Sarah moved so fast that none of them saw it coming. A single strike, precise and controlled, sent him sprawling onto the pavement. His friends barely had time to react before she turned to the next one, disarming him with a swift motion that left him gasping in shock. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Sarah Walker wasn't just a single mother. She was the most feared Navy SEAL to ever serve, and tonight they were about to learn exactly what that meant. The moment Scarjaw hit the ground, a stunned silence fell over the parking lot. His friends froze, their bravado replaced with something else. Confusion, disbelief. They had expected her to cower, to plead. Instead, she had moved with a kind of precision that only came from years of training, from muscle memory honed in the darkest corners of the world. Sarah stood still, her eyes scanning the remaining 4 men. She could hear Scarjaw groaning as he clutched his side, struggling to push himself up. "What the?" one of the others muttered, taking a step back without realizing it. Sarah didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Her silence said everything. One of them, a shorter guy with a buzz cut, pulled at Scarjaw's arm, trying to get him to stand. "Come on, man. Let's go." But the tallest of them, a man with cold blue eyes and a smirk that never quite reached them, wasn't ready to back down. He had been watching her closely, assessing her. He wasn't just angry, he was curious. "That was a mistake," he said, his voice low. He took a slow step forward, his posture shifting slightly. He wasn't like the others. He had some training. Maybe military, maybe something else. Sarah's heart remained steady. She had been trained to read people, to see them for what they truly were beneath the surface. This man was dangerous in a way the others weren't. Not because he was stronger, but because he wasn't a fool. She didn't reply. She simply watched, waiting. A slow grin spread across his face. "You're not just some waitress, are you?" Sarah still didn't answer. Instead, she turned slightly, her body shifting into a stance that only someone trained in combat would recognize. A subtle move, but he caught it. His grin faded. "I knew it," he murmured. He glanced at his friends, shaking his head. "You idiots don't even realize what just happened, do you?" Scarjaw, still struggling to stand, wiped blood from his mouth. "She just got lucky." "No," Blue Eyes interrupted. "She didn't." His gaze flickered back to Sarah. "Who are you?" Sarah didn't owe him an explanation. She had wasted enough time here. Without another word, she turned and walked toward her car. "Hey," Scarjaw barked. "We're not done." Sarah ignored him, unlocking her car door. She didn't expect them to let this go, but she hoped they were smart enough to reconsider. Behind her, Blue Eyes exhaled sharply, like he had just made a decision. "Get in the car," he told the others. Scarjaw looked like he wanted to argue, but after a moment, he obeyed. The group climbed into a black SUV parked near the edge of the lot. The engine roared to life, and the tires screeched as they sped off into the night. Sarah waited until their taillights disappeared before getting in her own car. Her hands were steady on the wheel, but her mind was already working. They weren't done with her. She knew that much. She drove in silence, the quiet hum of the road filling the space around her. The town was small, and she had been careful when choosing it. She hadn't wanted trouble. She had wanted peace. But trouble had a way of finding her, no matter where she went. By the time she pulled up to the house, the tension in her shoulders had settled into something familiar: readiness. It had been years since she had left the Seals, but there were some things she would never unlearn. She stepped out of the car and took a slow look around. The street was quiet. A few porch lights flickered in the distance, but nothing seemed out of place. Still, she double-checked the locks before heading inside. Liam was already asleep when she peeked into his room. His small form was curled beneath the blankets, his chest rising and falling in deep, even breaths. The sight of him made her exhale, some of the weight in her chest easing. This was why she had left her old life behind. For him. She pulled the door closed gently and walked into the kitchen, pouring herself a glass of water. Her reflection in the window caught her eye. There was no fear there, no uncertainty, just the same woman who had survived wars, who had led missions no one else could. But that woman was supposed to be gone. She rubbed her forehead, thinking. She had seen their faces. They had seen hers. And Blue Eyes, whoever he was, had recognized that she wasn't just another woman. He would want to know more. A part of her hoped they would let it go, but she knew better. The past had a way of catching up, no matter how far she ran. And tonight, it had found her again. The night passed slowly. Sarah lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to every creak of the house, every rustling branch outside. She had learned long ago that silence could be just as dangerous as noise. It was the waiting, the unknown, that tested people the most. But she was built for this. She had spent years in places where a single wrong move meant never coming home. Still, this was different. She wasn't on a mission. She wasn't behind enemy lines. She was in her home, in a quiet town, trying to give her son a normal life. But trouble had already started to circle. She could feel it. Those men weren't just going to walk away. And the one with the cold blue eyes, he had seen something in her. Something she didn't want seen. By the time the sun rose, Sarah was up, moving through her routine as if nothing had changed. She made breakfast, packed Liam's lunch, and got him ready for school. He was full of energy, talking about a field trip next week, barely noticing the tired look in her eyes. "Are you listening, Mom?" Liam asked, swinging his backpack over his shoulder. Sarah smiled, brushing a hand over his dark curls. "Of course I am. A trip to the science center, right?" Liam grinned. "Yeah, we get to see the dinosaur exhibit. You have to sign the permission slip." "I'll take care of it." She bent down, pressing a kiss to his forehead. "Now go wait in the car. I'll be right out." As he ran off, Sarah's expression shifted. She glanced out the window, scanning the street. Everything looked normal. Too normal. It was the kind of quiet that made her instincts itch. She grabbed her jacket and stepped outside, locking the door behind her. The drive to school was uneventful, but she still kept an eye on the mirrors. No sign of them. No black SUV lurking at the edge of her vision. After dropping Liam off, she drove to the diner. It was still early, the air crisp, the streets slowly filling with people heading to work. Inside, the familiar scent of coffee and bacon greeted her. "Morning, Sarah," Janine, the owner, called from behind the counter. "You look like you didn't sleep." Sarah forced a small smile. "Rough night." Janine nodded knowingly. "Tell me about it. A guy spilled syrup all over booth 3 yesterday. Took me an hour to clean." Sarah appreciated Janine's usual chatter. It grounded her, made things feel normal. She grabbed an apron and got to work. But as the morning rush came and went, her thoughts kept drifting back to last night. Then, just before noon, the door opened and she felt it. A shift in the air. She turned her head slightly, her hands tightening on the coffee pot she had been refilling. Blue Eyes had walked in, alone. He didn't sit right away. He scanned the room first, as if making sure no one was paying attention. Then he slid into a booth near the back. Sarah inhaled slowly, keeping her movements calm as she walked over. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice flat. He looked up at her, studying her face before leaning back against the seat. "Just coffee." She didn't move. That all. A slow smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. "For now." Sarah poured the coffee, setting the cup down in front of him. "Then enjoy it." She turned to walk away, but his voice stopped her. "You were military." She froze for half a second. Most people wouldn't have noticed, but she knew he did. Slowly, she turned back to face him. "What makes you think that?" "The way you move." He picked up his coffee, taking a sip. "The way you took down Scar last night, that wasn't luck." Sarah didn't respond. She kept her face unreadable, but inside, her mind was already working through possibilities. Blue Eyes set his cup down. "I looked into you." Now, her pulse did spike, just slightly, and... Sarah Walker. Moved here 2 years ago. No family listed. Work history looks clean, but too clean. He tilted his head, like someone wiped the rest. She said nothing. His smirk faded. "Who are you running from?" That question struck deeper than she liked. It wasn't just about last night anymore. "I'm not running from anyone," she said finally. "Then why hide?" Sarah leaned in slightly. "You don't want to know who I am." He held her gaze, searching for something. Then he exhaled, shaking his head. "You're right, I probably don't." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sounds of the diner moved around them, dishes clinking, the low murmur of conversations. Then he leaned forward. "But my guys, they don't let things go easy. And Scar, he's got a temper. You embarrassed him. That's not gonna sit well." Sarah already knew that, but hearing it confirmed didn't help. "I can handle myself," she said. Blue Eyes nodded. "Yeah, I figured." He hesitated. "But there's something else you should know. Those guys, they're not just some punks looking for trouble." He lowered his voice. "They work for someone." That got her attention. "Who?" He glanced toward the window, as if checking for something, then back at her. A man named Vincent Kane runs things around here, quietly, controls people without them even realizing it. He paused, scars his nephew. Sarah let that sink in. You hurt him, Blue Eyes continued. That means Kane's gonna hear about it, and Kane doesn't like people messing with his family. Sarah had been in situations like this before. Men like Kane thought they owned the world. They thrived on control. But there was always a weakness. Why are you telling me this? She asked. Blue Eyes exhaled. Because I've seen what Kane does to people who cross him. And you've got a kid. That hit harder than she expected. Sarah straightened. If he comes for me, he won't like what he finds. Blue Eyes studied her for another long moment. Then he reached into his pocket, pulled out a small piece of paper, and slid it across the table. My name's Eric, he said. If things go south, call me. Sarah didn't take the paper. Eric sighed, standing. Your choice. He dropped a few bills on the table, nodded once, and walked out. Sarah stood there for a long moment before finally picking up the paper. This wasn't over, not even close. The afternoon air felt heavier than usual as Sarah stepped out of the diner. The conversation with Eric still echoed in her mind, each word pressing down like a warning she couldn't ignore. Vincent Kane, a name she didn't know but one that carried weight in this town. A man who pulled strings from the shadows, who had people like Scar and his crew doing his dirty work. And now, because of one quick decision in a parking lot, she was on his radar. She drove through town with her eyes flicking to the rearview mirror more often than usual. The streets were the same, the faces familiar, but everything felt different, like there was something unseen moving beneath the surface waiting. When she pulled up to Liam's school, she felt the tension in her stomach tighten. The black SUV wasn't there, but that didn't mean they weren't watching. She scanned the parking lot as parents gathered to pick up their kids. Nothing seemed out of place, but her instincts wouldn't let her relax. Liam came running toward her, his face bright with excitement. Mom, guess what? My teacher said I get to help set up for the science fair. Sarah forced a smile, pushing everything else aside. That's great, Bud. He climbed into the back seat, still talking, and she forced herself to listen, to stay present. But as she pulled out of the parking lot, her grip on the steering wheel tightened. She needed to be sure they weren't being followed. Taking a longer route home, she turned down side streets, watching for anything out of place. When she was sure no one was behind them, she finally exhaled. Liam didn't notice. He was too busy explaining how he got picked for the project, but Sarah's mind was somewhere else. She was already working through possibilities, through what would come next. That night, after putting Liam to bed, she sat at the kitchen table, staring at the small piece of paper Eric had left her. His name and number, written in rushed handwriting. He had warned her for a reason. He knew what Kane was capable of. She tapped the paper against the table, considering. Calling him would mean opening a door she wasn't sure she wanted to open, but doing nothing wasn't an option either. Before she could decide, the porch light outside flickered. Her body went still. She turned her head slightly, listening. The street outside was quiet, but something felt wrong. She stood, moving toward the window, keeping herself just out of sight. Then she saw it, a figure standing just beyond the reach of the street lamp, not moving, just watching. Her pulse remained steady, but her breath slowed. She had seen this kind of intimidation before. This was a message. They wanted her to know they were there, that they weren't going away. She stepped back, reaching for her phone. She could call the police, but that would only make things worse. Men like Kane didn't fear the law. They owned it. Instead, she did something she hadn't done in a long time. She reached into the closet, pulling out a small locked box from the top shelf. Inside was a single item, a reminder of a past she had tried to leave behind. Her Navy SEAL-issued knife. She ran her fingers over the worn handle, the weight of it familiar in her hand. She hadn't needed it in years, but tonight it felt like a part of her again. Moving back to the window, She checked outside. The figure was gone. But she knew this wasn't over. She locked every door, double-checked every window, and then sat in the dark, waiting. She wasn't afraid, but she wasn't going to let them catch her off guard. Hours passed, the night stretching on. At some point, exhaustion pulled at her, but she refused to sleep. Then, just past 2 a.m., a noise. Soft, near the back of the house. Sarah's grip tightened on the knife as she moved silently, her steps controlled, her breath steady. She knew the layout of the house better than anyone. She knew where every floorboard creaked, where every shadow fell. Another sound, a slow, careful footstep. They were inside. Sarah moved before they could. The hallway was dark, but she didn't need light. She caught the movement first, a shape near the back door, blending into the shadows. She struck fast. A calculated move, not meant to kill, just to send a message. The knife pressed against skin, and the figure froze. A sharp inhale. Then a whisper. Wait. Her grip tightened. You made a mistake coming here. I had to, the voice said, and now she recognized it. Eric. She pulled back slightly, but her stance didn't relax. You broke into my house. I didn't break in. He exhaled, stepping back into the dim light. His hands were raised. I needed to warn you. Sarah didn't lower the knife. You already did. No, he said, his voice urgent. Not like this. He hesitated. Kane knows who you are. The words hit harder than she expected. How? She asked, her voice colder now. Eric hesitated. I don't know how much he knows. But he's not just sending his guys after you anymore. He's sending a message. And that means he's planning something bigger. Sarah's mind raced. If Kane had figured out even a fraction of her past, this wasn't just about retaliation anymore. This was about power, control. And now she wasn't just a target, she was a threat. Eric took another step back, watching her carefully. You need to leave. Take your kid and go. Sarah shook her head. I don't run. Eric sighed. Then you need to be ready, because Kane, he's already making his move. Sarah tightened her grip on the knife. She wasn't just ready. She had been waiting for this. The weight of Eric's words settled between them, thick and unspoken. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat, steady but alert, the way it always was when something was coming. She had lived through ambushes, had walked into traps and made it out alive. But this was different. This wasn't enemy territory. This was her home, and Kane had turned it into something else. Eric shifted slightly, his eyes scanning the dimly lit hallway. I didn't mean to come in like this, he said, keeping his voice low. But you needed to know now. Kane's already set things in motion. Sarah's grip on the knife loosened just slightly. What exactly is he planning? Eric hesitated. He's not coming for you directly. Not yet. He's using something else. Someone else. Sarah's stomach went cold. Who? Eric's jaw tightened. The sheriff. The words hit harder than she expected. Sheriff Cole had been in this town longer than most people. He was the kind of man who kept things running smoothly, or so it seemed. But Sarah had always known there was something beneath the surface, something that didn't quite add up. Now it made sense. Kane wasn't just some back-alley operator. He had people in the system. He had leverage. What did he do? She asked. Eric exhaled. He put in a report. Claimed you assaulted Scar unprovoked. Said you're a danger to the town. He hesitated. And there's more. Sarah could already guess. Liam. Eric nodded. They're saying your past is unstable, that you've got violent tendencies. Child Protective Services is coming. Sarah felt something inside her snap into place. This was the play. Kane wasn't just threatening her. He was going for the one thing she couldn't fight with fists. He was using the system against her, twisting reality until she was the one who looked dangerous. A slow, measured breath left her lips. How long? Tomorrow, maybe sooner. Sarah's mind worked fast, analyzing every angle, every possibility. She couldn't just leave, not without knowing exactly what Kane's next move was. But she couldn't let them take Liam. That wasn't an option. Eric watched her, cautious. We need to get ahead of this. Sarah looked at him. How? Eric hesitated, then reached into his jacket, pulling out a folded piece of paper. He set it on the table between them. Sarah unfolded it, scanning the text. It wasn't just a report, it was everything. A file on her. Military history, declassified details, an official-looking psychiatric evaluation, fabricated, designed to make her look unstable. They've been building this for weeks, Eric said. Maybe longer. Sarah's hands tightened around the paper. Why are you helping me? Eric's expression darkened. Because I used to work for Kane. Silence stretched between them. I was never one of them, he said quickly, like he needed to make that clear. But I saw things, and when I tried to walk away, he made sure I had nowhere to go. I thought I was done with all of it, until I saw what they were doing to you. Sarah studied him, looking for the lie. But all she saw was exhaustion, regret. Why does Kane want me out of the way? She asked. Eric shook his head. I don't know, but I do know he doesn't want you dead. Not yet. If he did, it would have already happened. He wants control. And if he can't control you, he'll make sure you lose everything first. Sarah looked back down at the file. They had been planning this longer than she realized. This wasn't just about Scar or what had happened in the parking lot. This was bigger. A slow exhale left her lips. Then we changed the game. Eric frowned. What does that mean? Sarah's gaze lifted, sharp and certain. It means Kane thinks he knows who I am, but he doesn't. She folded the paper and slipped it into her pocket. I've been playing defense. That ends now. Eric looked at her for a long moment, then sighed. You're going after him, aren't you? Sarah's expression didn't change. Not yet. First, I make sure my son is safe. Then, I take away Kane's control. Eric rubbed a hand over his face. This is a bad idea. Sarah gave him a look. Then you should probably leave. Eric let out a breath, then shook his head. Hell no. If you're doing this, you're gonna need backup. Sarah nodded slightly. She wasn't used to trusting people, but right now, she didn't have much of a choice. The night stretched on, but Sarah didn't sleep. By the time the sun rose, she had a plan. And Kane had no idea what was coming. The morning air was crisp, but Sarah barely felt it as she stood by the window, watching the street. Liam was still asleep upstairs, his breathing steady and peaceful, unaware of the storm brewing around them. She had spent the night planning, thinking through every possible move Kane could make. He had played his hand, but he had underestimated her. That was his first mistake. Eric sat at the table, sipping coffee, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. You sure about this? He asked. Sarah nodded. I don't have a choice. Eric sighed, setting his cup down. Kane's expecting you to panic, to run. If you go straight at him, you're playing into his hands. Sarah shook her head. I'm not going after Kane. Not yet. She pulled out the fabricated file and set it between them. First, I take this apart. Eric frowned. You think you can? Sarah gave him a look. I don't think. I know. Eric exhaled. All right. Where do we start? Sarah tapped the file. The sheriff. By midday, she was standing outside the sheriff's office, her hands steady at her sides. Inside, Sheriff Cole was exactly where she expected him to be, leaning back in his chair, flipping through papers like he didn't have a care in the world. He barely looked up when she walked in. Sarah, he said, dragging out her name like it was some kind of joke. What brings you here? She stepped forward, placing the file on his desk. We need to talk. Cole raised an eyebrow, glancing at the papers. Not sure I see the point. Everything I need to know is already in there. Sarah leaned down slightly, meeting his gaze. That's the thing. Everything in that file, it's a lie, and you know it. Cole's lips curled into a smirk. That's so. Sarah didn't blink. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to call CPS and tell them there was a mistake, that the reports about me were fabricated, that there's no danger to my son. Cole let out a low chuckle. And why would I do that? Sarah reached into her pocket, pulling out her phone. She pressed a button, and a recording started playing. Cole's voice filled the room. ***, Kane wants her out. Doesn't matter how. Get that report filed. Make sure it sticks. ***. The color drained from his face. Sarah tilted her head. That sound familiar? Cole sat up, his hands gripping the edge of the desk. Where did you get that? Sarah's expression didn't change. You think Kane's the only one who knows how to collect information? She leaned in. You have two choices. You fix this, or that recording finds its way to every news outlet in the state. Cole's jaw clenched, but he knew he was trapped. With a slow breath, he picked up the phone. 15 minutes later, the CPS case was closed. Sarah didn't say another word as she walked out. Step 1 was done. Now it was time for Kane. She met Eric outside. He was leaning against her truck, watching her closely. That was fast. Sarah climbed into the driver's seat. Cole's not as brave as he pretends to be. Eric slid into the passenger side. And Kane. Sarah's grip tightened on the wheel. It's time we introduced ourselves properly. By the time they reached Kane's estate, a sprawling property on the edge of town, the sun was setting. Sarah parked a few blocks away, moving through the shadows with silent precision. Eric followed, keeping close, his breath steady but tense. They reached the side of the property, slipping past security cameras undetected. Sarah had studied the layout, memorized the weak points. She knew exactly where to go. As they reached the back entrance, Eric whispered, "Are we sure about this?" Sarah didn't answer. She didn't have to. The door was locked, but not for long. Within seconds, they were inside, moving through the darkened hallways. Voices echoed from a nearby room. Kane's voice. Sarah stepped forward, staying just out of sight. "You said this would be handled," Kane was saying, his voice sharp. "Now you're telling me she walked into the sheriff's office and flipped everything." Another voice, Scar. "We weren't expecting her to fight back." Kane let out a slow, cold chuckle. "You weren't expecting. Do you even know who she is?" Silence. Kane exhaled, shaking his head. "You idiots picked a fight with a Navy SEAL." Scar shifted uncomfortably. "She's just one person." Kane slammed his hand down on the desk. "No, she's not." He leaned in. "You don't understand what people like her can do, what they're trained for, and now she's coming for me." Scar's face paled. "What do we do?" Kane straightened, rolling his shoulders. "We finish this before she gets the chance." Sarah had heard enough. She stepped into the light. Too late. Kane's eyes snapped to her, his body going rigid. Scar took a step back, panic flashing in his eyes. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Kane smiled, slow and measured. "I was wondering when you'd show up." Sarah didn't blink. "You wanted a war, Kane. Now you've got one." Kane leaned back against his desk, studying her. "You're a smart woman, Sarah. You know how this ends." Sarah took a step closer. "I do. You lose." Kane chuckled. "You think you've won because you saved yourself from a CPS report, because you scared the sheriff into backing down." He shook his head. "That was just the opening move. You don't understand how deep this goes." Sarah's eyes stayed locked on him. "Then explain it to me." Kane exhaled, almost like he was disappointed. "I own this town, Sarah. The sheriff is just one piece. The mayor, the council, even the banks, they all answer to me. I could destroy you in 100 different ways, and you wouldn't see it coming." Sarah tilted her head. "Then why haven't you?" Kane's jaw clenched. She smiled, just slightly. "Because you're scared." Kane's face darkened. Sarah took another step forward. You've built your empire on fear, but you can't intimidate me, and you can't break me. Her voice dropped lower. So what's left, Cain? The room was silent. Then Cain exhaled, shaking his head. You should have left when you had the chance. A flicker of movement, Scar reaching for a weapon. Sarah moved faster. In seconds, she had Scar on the ground, his wrist twisted back at a brutal angle. He let out a sharp cry, the gun clattering to the floor. Eric kicked it away. Cain's eyes flickered, calculating. But Sarah saw it now, the moment he realized he had already lost. She released Scar, stepping back. This ends now, she said, her voice steady. You walk away. You leave me and my son alone. Or next time, you won't see me coming. Cain met her gaze, something unreadable in his eyes. Then slowly he nodded. Sarah didn't wait for more. She turned, walking out, Eric at her side. As they stepped into the night, Eric exhaled. You think that's really the end of it? Sarah didn't answer right away. She glanced back once, just for a second. Then she kept walking, because she knew the truth. Men like Cain didn't forget. But neither did she. The night air felt different as Sarah and Eric walked away from Cain's estate. It was quiet, but not peaceful, more like the calm after a storm, when the damage had been done, but the weight of it still lingered. Eric stole a glance at her, as if waiting for some kind of reaction, but Sarah didn't say anything. She was still listening to the echoes of what had just happened, still running through every detail in her mind. They reached the truck, and she climbed in, gripping the wheel with steady hands. Eric settled into the passenger seat, letting out a slow breath. You really think he'll back off? Sarah's jaw tightened. For now. Eric rubbed a hand over his face. You don't sound convinced. Sarah turned the key, and the engine rumbled to life. Men like Cain don't just walk away, but he knows I won't either. Eric nodded, staring out at the darkened road ahead. So what now? Sarah didn't answer right away. Instead, she drove. The quiet hum of the tires on the pavement filled the space between them. She could feel the weight of everything settling in. The fight, the threats, the choices she had made. It was over, but at the same time it wasn't. Not really. By the time they reached her house, the sky had started to lighten. The first hints of dawn peeked through the trees, casting long shadows over the driveway. Sarah killed the engine and sat for a moment, letting the silence settle. Eric sighed, stretching his arms. You need some sleep. Sarah smirked slightly. You sound like my doctor. He shook his head. I'm serious. You've been running on nothing but adrenaline. It's gonna catch up to you. Sarah glanced toward the house. I'll rest when I know my son is safe. Eric didn't argue. He knew better. She stepped out of the truck, moving toward the front door with quiet, measured steps. The house was exactly as she had left it. No signs of intrusion, no threats lurking in the shadows. Still, she scanned every corner as she stepped inside, listening, feeling. Then she heard it, the soft, even breathing coming from upstairs. Liam. Relief washed over her in a slow, steady wave. She moved toward his room, pushing the door open just enough to see him curled up in his bed, safe, unaware of how close things had come to falling apart. Sarah leaned against the doorway for a moment, just watching him. This was why she fought. Why she had done everything she did. Not for revenge, not for pride, but for this, for the quiet safety of her son sleeping peacefully in his bed, without fear, without danger lurking just outside his door. She exhaled slowly, then stepped back, closing the door softly behind her. Eric was still downstairs, leaning against the kitchen counter. He looked up as she walked in. He okay? Sarah nodded. Yeah. Eric studied her. And you? She let out a quiet breath, running a hand through her hair. I will be. He nodded, accepting that as the only answer she was ready to give. The next few days passed in a strange kind of stillness. The threats had stopped. No one followed her. No one tried to dig up more lies about her past. The sheriff kept his head down, avoiding her entirely. Even Kane's men seemed to have disappeared. It was unsettling in its own way, like waiting for a second wave that might never come. But Sarah didn't take the silence for granted. She stayed ready. She made sure Liam was never alone, that he stayed close, that he didn't see the weight of what had happened pressing down on her shoulders. And when he laughed, when he played in the backyard, when he asked her to sit with him and watch cartoons in the morning, she did, because this was what mattered. Eric stayed too, not in an obvious way. He just always seemed to be around, showing up with groceries, checking in without asking too many questions. Sarah didn't push him away. She wasn't sure why. One evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the sun dip behind the trees, Eric leaned forward, resting his arms on his knees. So, what happens if Kane comes back? Sarah watched the sky turn from gold to deep blue. Then I'll be ready. Eric exhaled. You ever think about leaving? She glanced at him. Running, you mean? He shook his head. Not running, just a fresh start, somewhere new. Sarah looked down at her hands. The idea of leaving had crossed her mind before, but it never stuck. I used to think that would solve everything, she admitted. But trouble has a way of following you, no matter where you go. Eric nodded slowly. Yeah, I get that. They sat in silence for a while, the sounds of crickets filling the air around them. Then Sarah said, I'm not going anywhere. Not yet. Eric smirked slightly. Didn't think so. The next morning, she got a call. It wasn't from Kane. Not from the sheriff either. It was a number she didn't recognize. She hesitated, then answered, Hello. A pause. Then a voice she hadn't expected. Miss Carter. Sarah stiffened. Who's this? The man on the other end cleared his throat. Name's Vincent Hale, federal investigator. Her grip on the phone tightened slightly. And why are you calling me? Another pause. Let's just say, I've been looking into Kane. Sarah's pulse ticked up. And? Vincent exhaled. And I think it's time someone brought him down. Sarah's jaw clenched. If you're looking for evidence, I'm fresh out. I don't think that's true, Vincent said calmly. I know what he's done, but I need someone who's seen it firsthand. Someone who isn't afraid to stand up to him. Sarah exhaled slowly. And you think that's me? Vincent chuckled. I know it's you. She thought about that for a long moment. Kane had backed off, but that didn't mean he was gone. He was still out there, still pulling strings, still waiting for the right moment. If she turned her back now, he'd find another way. Another person to control. Another family to ruin. She closed her eyes briefly, then opened them. What do you need? Vincent's voice was steady. Meet me. Let's talk. Sarah glanced out the window, at the quiet street, at the world that still looked normal on the surface. Then she nodded to herself. Send me the time and place. She hung up. Eric was watching her from the table. That sounded serious. Sarah looked at him. Then slowly she smiled. It is. And for the first time in a long time, she wasn't just waiting for the fight to come to her. She was walking straight into it. But this time she wasn't alone.